The heavy rain of a late New England autumn lashed against the stained glass windows of brownstone apartment in Beacon Hill, Boston. Inside, the world was silent, smelling faintly of old paper, leather-bound history volumes, and loose English tea. 74-year-old Alastair Vance sat in his favorite wingback chair, a brass reading lamp illuminating the dense pages of a text on the American Revolution. Alastair was a retired professor of history, a man whose entire life had been dedicated to analyzing sources, cross-referencing dates, and spotting the tiniest inconsistencies in centuries-old documents. His mind was as sharp as a freshly honed razor, even if his knees were stiffening with age. Over a 40-year career, he had saved a comfortable $350,000, deliberately set aside in a high-yield account intended strictly for the future education of his descendants. A sudden, violent pounding on his heavy oak front door shattered the quiet afternoon. Alastair frowned, setting his tea down with a soft click. He stood up, smoothing his tweed vest, and walked down the long, book-lined hallway. When he opened the door, a drenched, shivering figure practically tumbled into the foyer. It was Connor, his 21-year-old grandson. "Grandpa, please, you have to help me," Connor gasped, his voice cracked with panic. He didn't even take off his wet jacket, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his backpack. "Connor, what on earth is wrong?" Alastair asked, his ohms calm, measured professorial tone instantly acting as a counterweight to the boy's frantic energy. "Take a breath, son. Step inside." Connor didn't move past the rug. Instead, he unzipped his bag with trembling fingers and pulled out a damp piece of paper enclosed in a plastic sleeve. "My life is over, Grandpa. If I don't get this sorted by Tuesday morning, I'm being expelled. They're going to strip my credits and kick me out of Boston University." Alastair took the plastic sleeve, his eyes narrowing. Through the transparent plastic, a bold letterhead caught his eye. Boston University, Office of the Registrar. Final notice of tuition arrears. "Sit down, Connor," Alastair directed, walking into the living room and adjusting his reading glasses. Connor slumped onto the edge of a leather sofa, burying his face in his hands, letting out a heavy, theatrical sob. "It was a banking error, Grandpa. My financial aid didn't clear, and the bursar's office says because it's the final semester, I owe $40,000 immediately. If the wire transfer isn't confirmed by Tuesday, they will terminate my enrollment. 4 years of hard work, down the drain. Mom and Dad will never forgive me." Alastair held the document up under the bright glow of the brass lamp. His eyes scanned the text. To the average eye, it looked terrifyingly official. It had the university seal, a sternly worded legal warning, and a signature from the deputy registrar. But Alastair wasn't the average eye. He had spent 4 decades looking at official university documentation. His eyes locked onto the student identification number printed at the top right. It was a 9-digit code starting with the prefix BU22. Alastair's brow twitched. Boston University had transitioned its entire database to a purely numeric U-prefix system over 18 months ago. He looked closer at the digital signature of the deputy registrar. The ink texture had a slight, artificial pixelation, the unmistakable hallmark of a high-resolution Photoshop clone. And finally, the font used for the monetary amount $40,000 was slightly misaligned with the rest of the text matrix, set in Calibri instead of the standard Arial used by the university administration. Alastair looked over the top of his glasses at his grandson. Connor was still face down in his hands, but his shoulders weren't shaking anymore. He was perfectly still, waiting for the reaction. A deep, profound chill settled into Alastair's chest. The boy wasn't just asking for help, he was running a con. $40,000 is a significant sum, Connor, Alastair said, his voice dropping into a smooth, unreadable flat line. He carefully placed the document on the side table. "The banks are closed for the weekend. I will need until Monday morning to contact the branch manager and arrange for a liquidation from the savings bond." Connor snapped his head up, his eyes flashing with a sudden, poorly concealed spark of absolute relief. So, you'll do it? You'll save me, Grandpa? I have always told you that your education is my highest priority, Connor, Alistair replied, his face an impenetrable mask of grandfatherly concern. Go home. Dry off. Come back here on Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock. The money will be ready. Thank you, Grandpa. You're a lifesaver, Connor cried, throwing his arms around the old man before quickly gathering his bag and rushing back out into the rain. Alistair stood by the window, watching the tail lights of Connor's car disappear down the street. The moment the car was gone, Alistair walked over to his desk, picked up his landline phone, and dialed a number he knew by heart, the private cell phone of the Dean of History at Boston University, an old colleague he had shared a faculty lounge with for 30 years. The audit had officially begun. The rain had stopped by Saturday evening, leaving the brick streets of Beacon Hill slick and shining under the gas lamps. Inside his study, Alistair Vance sat at his mahogany desk, the telephone receiver pressed to his ear. Arthur, it's Alistair. I apologize for calling you on a weekend, Alistair said, his voice flat, but carrying the weight of a seasoned academic. On the other end of the line was Arthur Pendleton, the Dean of History at Boston University, and a friend of Alistair's for over 30 years. Alistair, always a pleasure. No need to apologize. What's on your mind? Arthur replied warmly. I need a quiet favor. No paperwork, just a verbal confirmation. It concerns my grandson, Connor Vance. He's a senior in the economics department. I need to know the exact status of his tuition account and his academic standing. There was a brief pause on the line, followed by the faint sound of computer keys clicking. Arthur's tone shifted from casual warmth to a hesitant, somber professional register. Alistair, are you aware of what's been going on with the boy? Alistair felt his grip tighten on the pen in his hand. Tell me, Arthur. Connor isn't a senior, Alistair. He hasn't been for a long time. Arthur sighed. He was officially suspended 12 months ago, at the end of his sophomore year, for academic fraud. He was caught buying essays online. And 3 months after that, the university officially terminated his enrollment because he failed to pay his basic fees. The bursar's office sent multiple notices to his off-campus address. He hasn't attended a single class at Boston University in a full calendar year. The words hit Alistair like a physical blow, but his face remained completely expressionless, his eyes fixed on the forged document Connor had left behind, and the $40,000 urgent tuition arrears notice. A total fabrication, Arthur said firmly. The university never issues notices formatted like that, and we certainly don't expel students over a single banking delay on the final week. Alistair, the boy is using our name to pull a scam. Thank you, Arthur. I appreciate your discretion. Please keep this between us, Alistair said quietly, before lowering the receiver back onto its cradle. He sat in the silence of his study for a long time. The grief was sharp, but the scholar in him immediately took over. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and began to cross-examine the facts. If Connor hadn't been paying tuition for a year, where had the thousands of dollars his parents gave him gone? And why did he need $40,000 in cash by Monday morning? Alistair opened his laptop and pulled up the public financial records of local courts, then shifted his search to online trading forums and local shadow banking networks. Using his analytical skills, he tracked the digital breadcrumbs Connor had left behind under his public usernames. By midnight, the picture was crystal clear. Connor wasn't paying for textbooks or lab fees. He had fallen deep into the volatile world of illegal online sports gambling and high-risk cryptocurrency leverage trading. He had borrowed money from aggressive local loan sharks to fund his addiction, and the clock had finally run out. They were threatening him, and Connor had decided that the easiest way out of his cage was to pick his grandfather's pockets. Alistair closed the laptop. His face was set in grim determination. He looked at the forged tuition letter. Connor thought he had successfully exploited an old man's love for education. He had no idea that he had just handed a master professor the perfect syllabus for a lesson in consequences. Sunday passed in a quiet, calculating blur. Alastair did not call Connor's parents. To involve them now would only create a flurry of emotional panic, giving Connor room to twist the narrative, weep, and beg for another soft landing. No, the boy needed to face the full weight of the machine he had set in motion. On Monday morning, Alastair walked out into the crisp, biting Boston air and took a cab down to the financial district. He didn't visit his bank manager to liquidate his savings bonds. Instead, he rode the elevator to the 12th floor of a polished glass tower, stepping into the offices of Vance, Sterling and Associates, a prominent legal firm founded by his younger brother. Alastair sat across from a sharp-suited corporate attorney named Marcus Vance, who also happened to be Alastair's nephew. Marcus listened to the entire story, his eyes scanning the forged Boston University document and the printed logs of Connor's online gambling debts that Alastair had compiled. Marcus shook his head, a look of profound disgust crossing his face. "This is forged documentation used for financial extortion, Uncle Alastair," Marcus said, tapping the plastic sleeve. "In the state of Massachusetts, grand larceny and document forgery carry severe prison sentences. If you hand him $40,000 under these false pretenses, it's a crime against you. But if you sign it over knowing it's a lie, you're just funding a criminal addiction." "I am not signing over a single dollar of my cash," Marcus, Alastair said, his voice dropping into that chillingly calm register he used right before failing a student for plagiarism. "I want to offer him an alternative, a legal trap. I need you to draft a very specific document." Marcus leaned forward, intrigued. "What kind of document?" "A conditional financial bailout and supervised restitution agreement," Alastair stated firmly. "The trust will clear his $40,000 debt directly to the creditors. Not a single cent touches Connor's hands. In exchange, Connor must legally confess to the forgery in writing within the contract. Furthermore, he will sign over his power of financial attorney to a legal guardian, freeze all his bank accounts, and commit to 2 years of mandatory full-time labor at the local community farm and soup kitchen under court-admissible supervision." Marcus smiled, a slow, predatory legal grin. "And if he refuses to sign, or if he violates the terms?" Then the written confession within the document automatically triggers a formal submission to the Boston Police Department and the Boston University Disciplinary Board for grand larceny and fraud, Alastair replied smoothly. "He will either work off his debt to society with his own 2 hands, or he will explain his Photoshop skills to a judge." By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Alastair was back in his Beacon Hill apartment. The heavy manila folder sat squarely in the center of his mahogany dining table. Next to it, Alastair placed a single, elegant fountain pen, the very pen he had used to grade thousands of university exams. At exactly 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Alastair didn't rush. He walked down the hallway with deliberate, measured steps and opened the door. Connor stood on the porch, his eyes wide, breathing heavily, looking like a man who had spent the last 48 hours staring into an abyss. "Grandpa," Connor gasped, stepping into the warm hallway. Is everything ready? Do you have the check?" "Come into the dining room, Connor," Alastair said softly, turning his back and walking inside. "Let's review the final terms." Connor followed his grandfather into the dining room, his boots clicking anxiously against the hardwood floor. His eyes immediately locked onto the thick manila folder, resting under the soft glow of the chandelier. He wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans, a desperate, frantic energy vibrating through his entire frame. "Sit down, Connor," Alastair said, taking his place at the head of the table. Connor practically collapsed into the chair opposite him. He leaned forward, his elbows pressing against the polished mahogany. "Grandpa, I really appreciate this. The registrar's office closes at 5 today. If I don't get the certified check to them by then, the system automatically drops my name from the graduation roster. Can we speed this up?" Alistair didn't move. He picked up the elegant black fountain pen and laid it precisely beside the Manila folder. "In academia, Connor, we never rush the final review. A single unchecked detail can ruin an entire thesis." "Grandpa, this isn't a thesis. It's my life." Connor's voice cracked, a flash of irritation slipping through his panicked facade. "Just give me the check, and I'll sign whatever receipt you need." Alistair slowly opened the folder. He didn't pull out a slip of banking paper. Instead, he drew out a multi-page document bound in blue legal cardstock, bearing the official embossed seal of Vance, Sterling and Associates. He slid it across the table until it rested right beneath Connor's nose. Connor frowned, his eyes darting across the title page. "Conditional financial bailout. What is this?" "Grandpa, where is the cashier's check?" "There is no check for you, Connor," Alistair said, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm, resonant depth. "Read the first clause." Connor's brow furrowed. He flipped the page, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. His mouth began to drop open as he read the words aloud, his voice dropping into a shaky whisper. "I, Connor Vance, hereby full confess to the fabrication and forgery of official Boston University documentation with the intent to illegally extract $40,000 from Alistair Vance." Connor stopped. The paper trembled in his hand. He looked up, the color completely drained from his face. "Grandpa, what kind of joke is this? I told you, the university sent me that letter. I didn't forge anything." "Clause 2, Connor," Alistair commanded, his blue eyes locking onto his grandson like steel rivets. "Read it." Connor's hands were shaking violently now. He looked down at the paper, his eyes blurring with tears of anger and fear. "The funds provided by the Vance Family Trust will be wired directly to the designated third-party debt collectors to satisfy the outstanding balance of $40,000 accumulated through illegal online sports gambling and high-risk cryptocurrency trading. No liquid assets shall be transferred to Connor Vance." Connor slammed the document down on the table, standing up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. "You spied on me? You went behind my back and looked into my life." "I didn't have to spy, Connor. You left a trail of digital garbage a freshman could track," Alistair said, leaning back in his chair, completely unbothered by the boy's outburst. "But more importantly, I called Dean Arthur Pendleton on Saturday. You haven't been a student at Boston University in a 12-month. You were expelled for plagiarism and non-payment a year ago." The silence that followed was suffocating. The mask of the panicked, desperate student was completely shattered, leaving behind a caught, cornered predator. Connor stared at his grandfather, his chest heaving, his teeth clenched as the full realization of his failed con began to set in. Connor's face contorted, the last remnants of his boyish innocence evaporating into a mask of pure rage. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned white. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" Connor spat, his voice trembling with venomous anger. "Sitting up here in your ivory tower with your dusty old books, judging everyone. You don't know what it's like out there. The pressure to succeed, the cost of living in this city. I made a bad bet. A couple of bad bets. I just needed a reset." "A reset requires honesty, Connor," Alistair said, his voice remaining an island of absolute calm in the middle of his grandson's emotional storm. "What you attempted was grand larceny against your own family. It's my inheritance anyway." Connor shrieked, slamming his fist onto the table. "You have hundreds of thousands of dollars just sitting in a bank account doing nothing. You're 74. What are you going to spend it on? New bookshelves? I am facing real people, Grandpa." Dangerous people. If I don't pay that $40,000 by tomorrow morning, they aren't going to suspend me, are going to break my legs. Then I suggest you sit down, pick up that fountain pen, and sign the document, Alistair said, pointing a steady finger at the blue-bound contract. Connor looked at the pen, then back at Alistair, a desperate, wild look in his eyes. If I sign this, I'm signing away my life. A written confession. 2 years of hard labor at a soup kitchen and a community farm, missing all my bank accounts. You're turning me into a prisoner. No, Alistair corrected firmly, leaning forward. I am giving you a syllabus for a life you drastically need to relearn. You will work with your hands. You will see what actual hardship looks like while serving food to the homeless. And you will pay back the trust every single cent through honest, supervised wages. And if I walk out that door right now, Connor threatened, taking a step back, his eyes darting toward the hallway. What if I just leave and find the money somewhere else? Alistair reached into the pocket of his tweed vest and pulled out his smartphone. He laid it flat on the table, right next to the fountain pen. If you cross that threshold without signing, I press a single button. My nephew Marcus is waiting at his office. The moment I signal him, the digital copies of your forged university document, your signed confession timeline, and the full dossier of your illegal gambling debts will be transmitted directly to the fraud division of the Boston Police Department and the dean's office at BU. Alistair looked at the grandfather clock. It was 3:45 p.m. The police station is only 4 blocks away, Connor. You have exactly 15 minutes to decide whether you want to carry a shovel at the community farm or wear handcuffs in a county jail. Connor stared at the phone. He looked at the door. He calculated his chances, his breathing ragged, his sweat dripping onto the polished wood of the dining table. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in on him, tighter and tighter, until there was nowhere left to run. The grandfather clock chimed once, a heavy, resonant strike marking the quarter hour. The sound seemed to break the final chord of resistance inside Connor. His shoulders slumped, the defiant anger draining out of him, leaving behind nothing but the hollow shell of a terrified 21-year-old boy who had run out of tricks. Slowly, with leaden steps, Connor pulled the heavy wooden chair back out and sat down. His eyes were red, staring blankly at the document that would dictate the next 2 years of his life. I sign it, Connor whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the heating vents. And the debt, it goes away? The people, they won't come after me? The trust will wire the funds directly to the creditors within the hour, Alistair said, his voice entirely professional, devoid of both malice and pity. The wolves will be off your porch, Connor, but you will be on mine. Pick up the pen. Connor reached out a trembling hand, gripped the heavy black fountain pen, and turned to the final page. Right above the line marked borrower-confessor, his hand hovered for a fraction of a second. Then, with a jagged, shaky stroke, he signed his name. Alistair pulled the document back, inspected the signature with the practiced eye of a professor verifying a final exam, and then signed his own name under lender trust representative. He closed the blue folder with a decisive snap. Marcus will meet you at the community farm tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock sharp to begin your intake, Alistair stated, standing up. Do not be late. A single unexcused absence, and the police dossier is submitted. Do you understand? Connor didn't answer. He simply nodded, stood up, and walked out of the dining room. There were no dramatic shouts this time, no slammed doors. The front door clicked shut with a quiet, final thud. Alistair walked over to the window, watching his grandson walk down the rainy Beacon Hill Street, his head bowed against the wind. The old professor felt a pang of sorrow in his chest. No grandfather wants to see his own blood humbled so harshly. But Alistair knew that soft grace would have only funded the boy's destruction. True love sometimes required the unyielding weight of an anchor. Turning back to his quiet study, Alistair sat down in his wingback chair. He picked up his book on the American Revolution, took a sip of his now cold tea, and adjusted his reading glasses. The Vance family trust was secure, the lessons were assigned, and the historical record of the family had been preserved. The master scholar turned the page.